You know that feeling when you realize you've built your entire life around something that isn't right? Like, everything looks fine on the outside, but on the inside, something's eating at you? That's where I was when I made the hardest decision of my life, walking away from Emily, the woman I loved. I thought I had it all figured out: career, house, a future that seemed perfect. I thought all that would make me feel fulfilled. But the truth is, even with everything in place, I felt empty. And not just a little empty. I felt like I was missing something huge. Something inside me wasn't where it should be. I'd worked hard to get to where I was. All the years of pushing, striving, and building up this life. And there she was, Emily, this incredible woman. She was everything I ever wanted: kind, smart, funny, beautiful. We had so much in common, and we'd had some great times together. But even though I loved her, I wasn't the man she needed me to be. I think that's what hurt the most. I loved her, but I knew deep down that I wasn't ready for the life she deserved. I had been running from my own problems, convincing myself that if I just kept pushing, I'd get there. That the next promotion, the next big paycheck, the next house would fill that void inside me. But it didn't. And I realized I was dragging her along in this life that wasn't even real for me. So, I made a decision. I had to let her go. Not because I didn't love her, but because I knew I wasn't ready to love myself, and if I didn't figure that out, I couldn't be the man she needed me to be. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But looking back, I can see that it was the only choice that made sense. Because sometimes, the hardest decisions lead you to the most unexpected transformations. I always thought that success would make everything click. You know the feeling. If I just worked a little harder, if I just earned a little more, if I just had the right title or the right house, then I'd finally feel like I made it. That's what I told myself, over and over. I had a good job, a nice house, a decent car. I was on the path. I thought that by the time I was in my 40s, things would be smooth sailing. But what no one tells you is that when you finally hit those milestones, you start to realize you've been chasing the wrong things. I wasn't unhappy. I was just stuck. Like I'd reached the top of the mountain only to realize there was nothing else up there. And as stupid as it sounds, I didn't know what I was supposed to do with all the success. It felt like an empty victory. I was caught in this weird cycle, working hard to prove I could do it, but also wondering, prove it to who? What was the point of it all? I thought maybe getting to the top would finally bring me peace. But instead, it just made me question everything. And then there was Emily. She had this clarity about her. She knew what she wanted, where she was headed. She had this inner peace I couldn't understand. She was driven, but not in the same way I was. She didn't chase things. She wasn't worried about the next promotion or the bigger house. She seemed grounded, happy with who she was, not what she had. I wanted to feel that way too. I wanted to feel content and confident in myself without constantly striving for the next thing. But the harder I tried to find it, the more I realized I was only running from the real problem. The problem wasn't my job. It wasn't Emily. It wasn't anything outside of me. The problem was I wasn't happy with myself. And no amount of money, no career achievement, no house or car could fix that. I was fooling myself into thinking that stuff would fill the hole inside me. I was the one who needed to change, but I didn't know how. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I might never get there. I might never become the man I wanted to be. And that scared the hell out of me. At first, everything with Emily was easy. We clicked right away. We shared the same sense of humor, the same values. We had this natural rhythm between us, and for a while, it felt like I had found everything I'd been looking for. She was the perfect match. But as time went on, something started to change. It wasn't that Emily did anything wrong, it was me. I was the one who started to drift. The more I worked, the more I focused on trying to be someone I wasn't, the further I pulled away from her. I couldn't help it. She was just better. Better at being herself. Better at finding peace with who she was. And the more I saw that, the more I felt like I wasn't good enough for her. She didn't know it at first. I hid it well. But the truth is, I wasn't happy with myself. And because of that, I couldn't fully be present for her. I couldn't give her everything I wanted to give. I thought maybe I just needed to work harder, push a little more, find that next step that would fill the gap. But it never worked. She started asking questions. Simple things like, "Are you okay? You don't seem like yourself lately." And I didn't know how to answer. How could I tell her that I was falling apart inside, that I was terrified of being the man I thought I was supposed to be, and that I wasn't sure if I could ever be the person she deserved? I could see the worry in her eyes. She wasn't pushing, but I could tell she was starting to sense that something was off. And I wasn't ready to admit it to her, or to myself. I didn't want to face the fact that the problem wasn't with her. It was with me. The more she reached out, the more I pulled back. I wasn't consciously trying to push her away, but I couldn't stop it. The fear of not being enough for her took over, and I built walls around myself without even realizing it. I remember the first time I felt it, like a faint crack in the foundation of our relationship. At first, I brushed it off, convinced that it was just a rough patch. Every couple goes through them, right? But as time passed, I couldn't ignore the growing distance between Emily and me. It wasn't anything obvious at first. No huge fights or dramatic moments. It was subtle. Little things. The silence at dinner became more uncomfortable. There was a time when we could sit and talk for hours about everything and nothing, but now the conversation felt forced. We'd talk about our day, she'd share what was going on at work, and I'd tell her about mine, but the connection that once flowed so naturally started to feel strained. More like two people filling the empty space with words, rather than actually talking. Then there were the evenings when I'd come home after a long day. Emily would be sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone or watching TV, her eyes distant. She didn't even look up when I walked in. I'd stand there, feeling like a stranger in my own home. At first, I tried to ignore it. I thought it was just her unwinding, maybe she was just tired. But it became clear, it wasn't just that. Something deeper was changing. She'd stopped asking about my day. She stopped asking about me altogether. And I started to wonder, was she even interested in me anymore? Was she starting to give up on us? It wasn't just her. I felt it too. I was slipping away from her. It wasn't intentional, but I found myself distracted. I was consumed by work, trying to achieve more, trying to prove myself to her and the world. I wasn't giving her the attention she deserved. I could feel it, deep down. She was pulling away because I was no longer the man she married. I was becoming someone else. Someone disconnected. Someone lost. The more I buried myself in work, the more I withdrew from her. It wasn't like I didn't want to be present. I did. I wanted to fix things, but the more I tried to focus on our relationship, the more pressure I felt to make it better. Every attempt seemed to fall flat, like putting a band-aid on a wound that needed stitches. I tried to talk to her about it, tried to get her to open up, but it was like I was speaking a different language. We'd have conversations, sure, but they weren't real conversations. They were surface level, safe, avoiding the hard truths. I remember the night it all came to a head. We were sitting on the couch, watching TV, again, not really watching, just filling the space. Emily had her feet tucked up beneath her, her phone in hand, her attention more on that screen than on me. I was sitting beside her, but it felt like we were on opposite ends of the world. And I had this overwhelming feeling that if I didn't do something soon, it would all just slip away. I turned to her, and for the first time in a long while, I said what was on my mind. "Emily, what's going on with us? You feel distant. I feel distant. What happened to us?" She put down her phone and looked at me for a moment, almost as if she was surprised I noticed. Then, in the quietest voice, she said, "I don't know, John. I think we've just changed. We're not the same people anymore." And in that moment, I felt it hit me like a punch to the gut. That was it. The words I had been dreading to hear for months. She wasn't blaming me. She wasn't pointing fingers. But I could feel the weight of it, the slow, steady erosion of something that once felt so strong. We had changed. We had grown apart. We were still living together, still sharing space, but something vital, something that had once made our connection so effortless, was gone. I didn't know what to say. My mind raced, trying to grasp at something, anything, that could make sense of it. But in that moment, the truth hit me like a ton of bricks. We were two people living in parallel lines, drifting farther and farther apart. And the worst part? I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to bring us back. I looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't the woman I'd fallen in love with, and I wasn't the man she had married. We had both changed, but we had changed in ways that no longer meshed. And that was the hardest part. I had tried so hard to keep everything together, to fix what was broken, but I had missed the truth all along. The change was already happening. Emily was right. We were no longer the same people. The spark was gone. The chemistry we once had, gone. And it wasn't just her pulling away. It was me, too. I had pulled away long before she did. I had gotten lost in the chase for external success, for approval, for something that would validate me. But in doing so, I had lost sight of what really mattered us. That night, I went to bed with a heaviness in my chest. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: if we didn't address this now, we might not ever get the chance to. I felt the pressure mounting. I was scared. I was confused. And I had no idea what the next step was. But deep down, I knew I had to face it. I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. Because, for the first time, I realized something important. Pretending everything was fine was what had gotten us into this mess in the first place. It wasn't a single moment. There was no dramatic fight, no big argument. It was more like a slow, painful awareness that I had been running from the truth for far too long. One night, we were sitting on the couch, in the same house we'd built together, watching TV, and I could feel it. That distance. The silence wasn't just between us. It was inside me too. I looked over at her. She was laughing at something on the screen, and for a second, I wanted to join in. But instead, I felt this overwhelming weight on my chest. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I'm not the man she needs. That's when it became clear. I wasn't just falling short in the relationship. I was falling short as a person. I wasn't happy with who I was, and it wasn't fair to Emily to drag her along while I tried to figure myself out. She deserved someone whole, someone who could meet her where she was. I wasn't that guy. I remember sitting there, frozen, while she kept talking, not knowing I was falling apart inside. It wasn't her. It was me. And I realized I had to make a decision, because I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I thought I could fix it. Maybe if I just worked harder, maybe if I just pretended a little longer, things would work out. But I knew that was a lie. I was tired of lying to myself, to her. I had to face the truth. The truth that I couldn't give her the life she deserved until I figured out how to give it to myself first. And that's when I knew. I had to walk away. I didn't know how to say it. How do you tell someone you love that you're walking away, not because you don't care, but because you care too much? I was terrified of losing her. Terrified of being alone. Terrified of facing the consequences of my own actions. But I knew that staying in the relationship would only make things worse in the long run. So, I sat down with Emily one evening, and it was like everything had been building up to this moment. I could see the confusion in her eyes as I started speaking, and I could feel my heart breaking as the words left my mouth. I told her I needed to leave. I told her I needed to work on myself before I could be the partner she deserved. She didn't understand at first. I could see it in her face. She thought I was giving up on her, on us. And maybe, in a way, I was. But I wasn't giving up on love. I was giving up on the version of me who couldn't show up for her. I was giving up on this life I had built out of fear and confusion. And I was doing it for both of us. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, telling her that. Watching the shock and hurt in her eyes was unbearable. I wanted to hold her, tell her I was sorry, that I loved her. But I knew deep down that this was the only way. This wasn't about us anymore, it was about me. I needed to be whole before I could be part of something bigger, she cried. And I did too. I think we both knew it wasn't the end of the story, but it was the end of this chapter. After the breakup, it felt like I was walking through fog. At first, there was this huge sense of relief. The decision was made, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. But that relief was quickly followed by a deep loneliness. It wasn't just the empty space in the house that got to me. It was the emptiness inside me, the realization that I still didn't have it figured out. I threw myself into work. I tried to focus on building my life again. But no matter how much I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. I wasn't fixed just because I had made a decision. There were nights when I'd think about her. Think about the way we'd laughed, the way we talked about the future. I missed her more than I wanted to admit. But I also knew that walking away was the right thing. I knew that I had to work through my own issues if I ever wanted to truly be the man she deserved, or the man I wanted to be. I started seeing a therapist. I worked through a lot of the pain and confusion I had been avoiding. I realized that for years, I'd been letting my fears dictate my actions. Fear of failure. Fear of not being good enough. But the more I worked on myself, the more I understood that being afraid didn't mean I was weak. It meant I was human. I didn't know where this journey would take me, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally heading in the right direction. And that was enough for me, for now. Months passed, and something started to change in me, slowly, but surely. I wasn't in a rush to move on or fix things overnight. I knew that wouldn't work. I had to rebuild myself from the inside out, piece by piece, like putting together a broken mirror. I spent a lot of nights just thinking about everything, about Emily, about our time together, about all the mistakes I made, and about the man I used to be before all this chaos took over. I'd be lying if I said I didn't still miss her. I thought about her often, about the way she smiled when she talked about her passions, the way we could stay up all night talking about life, and the way we'd hold each other without needing words. Those moments still stung sometimes. But with each passing day, I felt the fog lifting. The guilt, the shame, the self-loathing, they didn't disappear overnight, but they started to fade. And in their place? A strange, quiet kind of peace. For the first time, I started to really live with myself. I didn't need distractions. I didn't need constant achievements or material things to fill the void. I started journaling, writing about my fears, my dreams, my regrets. I wrote for hours, sometimes about things I hadn't even known I was holding on to. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I began to see something I hadn't noticed before. I was enough, just as I was. I didn't need to be perfect. I didn't need to have it all figured out. I didn't need to chase someone else's idea of success. It wasn't about fixing myself, because, let's be honest, no one is ever truly fixed. It was about accepting the parts of me that I had ignored for so long. The parts that were messy. The parts that were flawed. The parts that still needed work. And I realized that was okay. I wasn't broken. I was human. I had just been running from myself for so long, I forgot that the only way to move forward was to accept where I was. During this time, I also started doing things that felt right for me, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I started going on solo trips, just to clear my head. I began reading books that made me think differently about life, about love, about relationships, about how to be present. It was refreshing to be able to breathe without the pressure of having to be someone else. I could just be. But even with all of that, I still hadn't forgotten Emily. I knew she was out there, probably healing in her own way, living her life. And it hit me. I wanted to tell her about the changes I had made. Not because I thought we could get back together. God, no. That wasn't the point. But because I owed her the truth. I owed her the apology she deserved. It wasn't easy to admit, but I finally realized that I had never truly appreciated her for who she was. I had always been so focused on what I lacked that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. I hadn't given her the respect and love she deserved, because I was too busy trying to prove something to myself. That's when I made the decision to reach out. I wasn't sure if she'd want to talk to me. After everything, I wouldn't blame her if she didn't. But I knew I had to try. I had to be honest with her, about the mistakes I'd made, about how I had finally realized the role I played in our breakup, and how, even though we couldn't go back, I would always be grateful for what we had. So, I wrote her a letter. I told her everything. About my journey. About how I had finally started facing the parts of myself I'd ignored for years. I told her I was sorry for not being the man I should have been. For not seeing her the way I should have. I sent it, not expecting anything in return. But that's the thing about growth. Sometimes, you have to let go of expectations. It wasn't easy. There were days when I still found myself wanting to pick up the phone and call her. There were nights when the silence in the house felt like a void I couldn't fill, no matter how many times I went out or kept myself busy. But something changed in me after I heard from Emily. Her response was simple, but it gave me more than I expected. She had moved on, yes, but there was something else she wrote that stuck with me. I'm glad you're doing the work. I always knew you could be the man you wanted to be. Those words echoed in my mind for days after. She hadn't given up on me, even if our paths had diverged. And in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't just about her forgiveness, it was about my redemption. My understanding of what I was capable of. For so long, I'd been stuck in a loop of self-doubt, comparing myself to some ideal version of who I thought I should be. I had thought that if I just worked harder, earned more money, or somehow fixed myself, everything would fall into place. But the truth was, I wasn't broken. I was simply living under the weight of my own expectations and fears. When Emily wrote those words, I realized that I had been seeking approval from the wrong sources. I needed to approve of myself first. I had always been so caught up in the idea of being perfect, of having all the right answers, that I hadn't noticed the simple truth. The only person I needed to be good enough for was myself. It was a bittersweet realization, but it was also freeing, because I understood now that growth doesn't always happen the way we expect. It's not a clean, neat process. It's messy. It's painful. It's uncomfortable. But when you come out on the other side, you're not the same person you were when you started. After I read Emily's letter, I took a long walk, just me, my thoughts, and the cool evening air. I wasn't sure where this journey would take me, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel afraid of the unknown. I felt at peace, like I was finally where I was supposed to be. And I realized that this peace had nothing to do with anyone else. It wasn't about Emily, or the past, or any other person I was trying to impress. It was about me, and how I had learned to accept and love the version of myself that I had avoided for so long. The next few months were some of the most transformative of my life. I started working on the things that really mattered to me, not for validation, but because they made me feel fulfilled. I reconnected with old friends, took on new challenges at work, and even picked up a hobby I had abandoned years ago. I wasn't trying to become someone else anymore. I was just learning to be the best version of myself, and as time went on, I realized that I didn't need to constantly be seeking something to complete me. I was already whole. I was already enough. The decision to let go of Emily, while painful, had ultimately been the best thing for both of us. It allowed her to grow, and it allowed me to grow. We both moved forward, but it wasn't about finding new love or new partners. It was about finding peace within ourselves. It was about becoming the people we were always meant to be, separately, but no less complete. One day, I thought about the future. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel scared. I felt excited. Not because I had everything figured out, but because I knew that whatever came next, I would be ready for it. I was strong enough to face it. And I was no longer afraid to walk alone, because I had learned that walking alone didn't mean being lonely. It meant standing in my own truth, unafraid to face whatever life had to offer.